I always thought betrayal would feel like a thunderclap, sudden and violent. Instead, it slipped into my life as quietly as the Seattle rain that tapped against our bedroom window that night. 3:14 in the morning. I remember the exact time because the red digits of our alarm clock seemed to pulse through the darkness, matching the throb in my temples. Insomnia had become my unwelcome companion these past months, leaving me to wander our modern loft while Mara slept. Our home, all sleek lines and cool surfaces, had begun to feel like a museum of our failing marriage, pristine and untouchable. That night, as I stood to stretch my aching back, Mara's phone vibrated on her nightstand. Once, twice, 3 times. Unusual for this hour. I hesitated, one hand hovering above the glowing screen, my conscience waging a brief war with my suspicion. The latter one. The text notification illuminated her lock screen. "He's clueless, I'll drain him dry." My fingers went numb. The world narrowed to those 7 words, pulsing with a cold, clinical clarity. I glanced at Mara, her face serene in sleep, dark hair spilled across her pillow. How peaceful she looked, this stranger who shared my bed, my name, my life. I entered her passcode, our anniversary date, the irony not lost on me, and opened the full conversation. The sender was listed simply as J, but I didn't need the alphabet to tell me who it was. Julian Reese. Her colleague. The man who dined at our table, clinked glasses at our brewery's opening, laughed at my jokes while his eyes lingered on my wife. I scrolled up, each message another nail in the coffin of our 12-year marriage. Meeting went well. He thinks the brewery expansion is on track. Perfect. Keep him focused on that. The transfer tomorrow should go unnoticed. We need to move faster. My situation's getting complicated. Patience, baby. 6 more weeks and we're set. He's clueless, I'll drain him dry. My throat constricted as I read their exchange, clinical and calculating. This wasn't just an affair, it was a heist. My brewery, Carvercraft, the business I'd built from nothing while Mara climbed her corporate ladder, was apparently their piggy bank. And I was the fool with the hammer. I took 3 deep breaths, focusing on the rain's rhythm to steady myself. The initial shock gave way to something colder, harder, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I looked down at my sleeping wife again, studying her face as if for the first time. The slight upturn of her lips, the faint lines around her eyes that only appeared in certain light. 36 years old and still beautiful enough to stop conversations when she entered a room. Still capable of making my heart stutter, even now, even knowing. That's when I made my decision. I didn't wake her, didn't confront her, didn't throw her phone against the wall like every cell in my body screamed to do. Instead, I took a photo of the conversation with my own phone, replaced hers exactly as I'd found it, and retreated to the living room. Our floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Seattle skyline, a constellation of lights blurred by rain. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, letting the city's glow wash over me. Somewhere out there was Julian, probably in his downtown penthouse, plotting to take everything I'd built. Somewhere out there were answers to questions I hadn't even formulated yet. I slipped my hand into my pocket, fingers closing around my father's pocket watch, the only thing he'd left behind when he abandoned us 30 years ago. I'd carried it for years as a reminder of what betrayal looked like, what I'd promised never to become. Now it felt like a talisman of a different sort, a reminder that time was both enemy and ally. Dawn began to bleed through the clouds by the time my trembling subsided. I'd cried, silently and briefly, mourning not just Mara's betrayal but my own blindness. All those late nights at the office, the sudden interest in our finances, the subtle criticisms of my lack of ambition, despite the brewery's success, it formed a mosaic of deception I'd been too trusting to see. When Mara's alarm chimed at 6:30, I was in the kitchen brewing coffee, my face a mask of routine normalcy. She emerged in her silk robe, hair tousled in that deliberate way that once made my breath catch. "You're up early," she said, accepting the mug I offered. Her eyes, green and calculating, searched mine for any sign of disturbance. I smiled and let the lie form easily on my lips. "Couldn't sleep. Excited about the expansion meeting today." She returned the smile, relief flickering briefly across her features. "It's going to be great, babe. Everything we've worked for." I nodded, clinking my mug against hers in false celebration. "Everything," I agreed. As she turned to shower, I watched her retreating figure and felt something harden inside me. Let her think she had won. Let them both underestimate me while I pieced together the full extent of their scheme. I had always been the patient one, the methodical one, the qualities Mara had once loved and now mistook for weakness. The pocket watch weighed heavy in my pants pocket as I set it ticking again. It was time to play the long game. Seattle in March is a study in gray, 50 shades of it painted across the sky, reflected in puddles, and hanging like a veil between buildings. Some locals claim they can distinguish between types of rain here. Today's was the persistent, needle-fine kind that soaks you through without seeming to fall at all. 3 days had passed since I'd discovered Mara's text. 3 days of performative normalcy, of good morning kisses that tasted like ash, of discussing brewery logistics while my mind catalogued her every gesture for signs of deception. I had become an actor in my own life, and the exhaustion of it clung to me like the damp. I sat in my 4-year-old Subaru across from Cafe Vita in Capitol Hill, wipers lazily pushing aside the endless drizzle. Mara's sleek Audi was parked 2 blocks down, exactly where she shouldn't be on a Wednesday afternoon when she was supposedly at a marketing conference downtown. I'd called her office earlier, my voice disguised as a courier with an urgent package. Her assistant had helpfully informed me that Miss Carver was unavailable until Thursday. The lie wasn't surprising, the precision of my anger in response to it was. I felt it crystallize inside me, transforming from hot, chaotic pain into something cold and sharp-edged. Useful. At 2:27, Mara emerged from the cafe, a slash of crimson coat against the monochrome backdrop. She hadn't dressed for a conference but for someone's appreciation. Fitted black dress, heels that challenged the slick sidewalk. She moved with purpose, checking her phone and glancing over her shoulder before heading not toward her car but further down the street. I slipped out of my vehicle, baseball cap pulled low, and followed at a careful distance. The rain had emptied the streets of all but the most determined pedestrians, making me conspicuous in my hunter green jacket. I ducked into doorways when she paused, studied storefronts when she glanced back, became invisible in plain sight. 6 blocks later, she entered the Thompson Hotel. Not the main entrance, the side door leading directly to the upscale bar. I counted to 30 before following, choosing a corner booth with a partial view of where she sat at the bar, elegant fingers wrapped around a martini glass. Waiting. I ordered a whiskey I wouldn't drink and angled the brim of my cap lower. 20 minutes passed before he appeared. Julian Reese, 6 feet of tailored confidence with that perfect smile that sold million-dollar properties and, apparently, convincing lies. He kissed Mara's cheek with practiced familiarity, then guided her to a secluded booth on the opposite side from mine. Their body language told stories they thought no one could read. His hand lingering at the small of her back, her fingers brushing his wrist as she laughed at something he whispered. I felt strangely detached watching them, as if observing strangers in a film. I couldn't hear their conversation over the ambient music, but I didn't need to. Their expressions shifted from intimate to serious as they examined something on Julian's phone. Mara nodded repeatedly, her face showing the focused attention she once directed at our future plans. When they rose to leave 40 minutes later, I settled my untouched drink and exited through the kitchen, nodding at a confused server as if I belonged. Outside, I circled around to where Mara had parked, arriving just as they approached her Audi. I crouched behind a delivery van, close enough now to catch fragments of their conversation. Transfer is scheduled for Friday, Julian was saying, his voice carrying in the damp air. Once it clears, we'll have enough leverage to. He suspects nothing, Mara cut in, her voice both familiar and foreign to my ears. The expansion meeting went perfectly. All those craft beer fanatics on the board eating out of his hand, approving whatever he asks for. Julian laughed, a sound like breaking glass. And we'll be there to catch every dollar. Your husband's too busy playing beer wizard to notice the accounting discrepancies I've set up. Don't underestimate Eli, Mara said, surprising me. He's oblivious, not stupid. By the time he figures anything out, we'll be untraceable. Trust me. Julian pulled her close, kissing her with a possessiveness that should have sparked jealousy in me. Instead, I felt only a clinical interest in their dynamic, the power constantly shifting between them like mercury. After they parted, Julian to a black Tesla parked illegally at a hydrant, Mara to her Audi, I remained motionless, letting the rain soak through my jacket. When both vehicles had disappeared into traffic, I returned to Mara's parking spot and examined the ground. There, partially hidden beneath a puddle, lay something she'd dropped in her distraction, a key fob I didn't recognize. Not to our loft, not to her office. Something else entirely. I pocketed it, another piece to the puzzle forming in my mind. Rather than returning home, I drove to Mara's car dealer under the pretense of surprising her with a maintenance appointment. The service manager, who remembered me from prior visits, was happy to let me wait while they topped off her fluids, and while I slipped out to her car in the service bay to search it thoroughly. Beneath the spare tire in her trunk, I found what she'd been hiding, A burner phone, powered off and sealed in a plastic bag. The key to unraveling whatever Friday's transfer entailed. I photographed it from all angles before returning it exactly as I'd found it, rain dripping from my sleeves onto the pristine carpet of her trunk. The game was changing. I was no longer just a mark in their scheme, I was becoming the hunter. As I drove home through Seattle's endless downpour, I realized something about myself in this city. The rain never really stops here. It just changes form. My father's pocket watch lay open on my desk, its soft ticking unnaturally loud in the silence of my brewery office. 3:17 in the morning, and Seattle's industrial district was as quiet as it ever gets. Just the occasional rumble of early delivery trucks and the distant hum of the highway. The brewery's fermentation tanks cast long shadows across the concrete floor, their stainless steel surfaces reflecting the single desk lamp I'd allowed myself. Before me sat the burner phone I'd found in Mara's car. I'd waited until she was deep in sleep before slipping out of our loft, unable to risk examining it at home. The brewery, my creation and apparent target of their scheme, seemed the appropriate place to uncover the depth of her betrayal. The phone was cheap but new, a prepaid model available at any convenience store. It powered on without requiring a passcode, another sign of its disposable nature. Amateur, I thought, though I couldn't decide if that was reassuring or insulting. The call log showed only one recurring number, labeled simply as V. 8 calls over the past 2 weeks, most lasting less than 3 minutes. The most recent had been yesterday, shortly after Mara's meeting with Julian. V. The letter echoed in my mind, searching for significance. Victor? Mara's father had always regarded me with thinly veiled contempt, the brewery owner who'd stolen his daughter from the corporate lawyer they'd handpicked for her. But would he be involved in something like this? I turned to the text messages, where the true story unfolded in clinical detail. $75,000 transfer complete. Jay confirms account secure. Need another $50,000 by Friday. The interest is killing me. V says this is the last bailout. Get the brewery docs ready. The expansion loan approval is our window. You will never notice the diversion if we time it right. The pieces assembled themselves with sickening clarity. Mara had gambling debts, substantial ones. Julian, likely her bookie or facilitator, had turned lover and co-conspirator. And Victor Harrington, my father-in-law, was bankrolling their escape plan while they siphoned money from my brewery's expansion loan. I checked the calendar on my phone. The expansion loan funds would be deposited on Friday, 3 days from now. $800,000 that would vanish like morning mist if I didn't act. The watch ticked steadily beside me, its brass case worn smooth by generations of fingers. My grandfather had carried it through 2 wars. My father had abandoned it along with his family. Now it marked the seconds of my own private battle. I picked it up, feeling its weight, solid and unchanging while everything else in my life revealed itself as illusion. The minute hand swept forward with quiet precision, unconcerned with human drama. They thought they had it on their side. 3 more days to spring their trap. But time was now my ally, not theirs. My phone vibrated with an incoming call. 4:22 in the morning, who would call at this hour? The screen displayed Victor Harrington. Speak of the devil. I let it ring twice more, centering myself before answering. Victor. It's early. I kept my voice neutral, betraying nothing. Elias. His voice was bourbon rough, edged with the entitlement that old Seattle money brings. I hope I didn't wake you. A lie. He knew exactly what he was doing. I'm at the brewery. Inventory. Another lie offered as currency. A pause, weighted with calculation. Dedicated as always. That's what I've always admired about you, despite our differences. I said nothing, letting silence draw him out. It was a technique I'd learned in business negotiations. The first to speak often concedes ground. I'm calling about Mara, he finally continued. She mentioned you've been distant lately. Working too much. I thought perhaps we should have lunch tomorrow. Tomorrow. 1 day closer to Friday's transfer. What game was he playing? Why the sudden interest in my marriage, Victor? I kept my tone conversational, even as I began photographing the burner phone's messages. He chuckled, the sound devoid of warmth. Family is everything, Elias. I would have thought you'd understand that, given your background. The jab at my parentage, my father's abandonment, my mother's struggles, was typical Victor. Always the subtle knife between the ribs. Family loyalty is certainly a fascinating concept, I replied, thinking of the texts I'd just read. I'd be happy to discuss it over lunch. Noon at Canlis. I named Seattle's most expensive restaurant, a place where Victor's connections would ensure a private table. Perfect. His satisfaction was palpable. I look forward to it. After we disconnected, I continued methodically documenting every message on the burner phone. When I was finished, I returned it exactly as I'd found it and slipped the memory card into my wallet. Evidence secured. Dawn was breaking as I locked the brewery, the watch tucked safely in my pocket. Its ticking reminded me that clocks work both ways, counting down to destruction or building toward revelation. The choice was mine. As I drove home through awakening streets, I formulated my plan. I would need to move carefully, gathering intelligence while appearing oblivious. Victor, Julian, Mara, each had underestimated me, mistaking my patience for weakness, my trust for blindness. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city gleaming and treacherous, like time itself waiting for no one. Morning light spilled across our kitchen countertop as I prepared breakfast, an elaborate affair of omelets, fresh fruit, and the artisanal sourdough Mara preferred. A performance of domesticity while my mind worked 3 steps ahead. She appeared just as I was plating, wrapped in the silk robe I'd given her for our 10th anniversary. "What's all this?" she asked, eyebrow raised. Suspicion masked as pleasant surprise. I smiled, the expression fitting my face like a borrowed suit. "Can't a man cook for his wife?" "Of course." She accepted the coffee I offered, our fingers brushing. Once, that contact would have sent electricity through me. Now I felt only the cool metal of her wedding ring, another prop in our shared fiction. "I have lunch with your father today," I mentioned casually, watching her reaction over the rim of my mug. The subtle stiffening of her shoulders. The momentary freeze before she recovered. "Oh, what brought this on?" "He called early this morning. Seemed concerned about us." I kept my tone light. "Said you told him I've been distant." Her laugh was practiced, dismissive. "Dad's always been overprotective. You know how he is." I did know. Victor Harrington had spent 12 years making clear his daughter had married beneath her station. The brewery was quaint, my ambitions modest. Each word precision engineered to diminish. "I'm actually looking forward to it," I said, which was true, though not for reasons she'd understand. "Maybe it's time to rebuild some bridges." Relief softened her features. "That would be nice." She touched my arm, fingertips lingering. "And you seem better this morning. Less preoccupied." I covered her hand with mine, the gesture hollow as a prop handshake. "Just focused on the expansion. Friday's deposit will change everything." "Everything?" she echoed, eyes never leaving mine. After she left for work, I drove not to the brewery but to the public library downtown. Anonymous, untraceable research was the order of the day. I needed to understand Julian Reese beyond the polished exterior he presented. 4 hours and countless searches later, I had my answers. Julian wasn't just a real estate agent with expensive tastes. He was a man with a history, 3 failed businesses, a bankruptcy 5 years ago, and a recent stretch of improbable success handling properties beyond his previous league. Most telling was a complaint filed against him 2 years prior, allegations of mortgage fraud that mysteriously disappeared from court records. I saved everything to an encrypted drive, then moved to my next target, Victor Harrington's business dealings. My father-in-law's investment firm presented a gleaming facade, but public records revealed recent troubles, leveraged positions, regulatory inquiries, a quiet exodus of senior partners. The perfect storm for a man who valued reputation above all else. By 11:30, I arrived at Clueless, Seattle's temple to fine dining perched above Lake Union. Victor was already seated at the best table, surveying the cityscape like a monarch. At 62, he remained imposing, silver-haired and steel-spined, Rolex flashing as he gestured for the waiter. "Elias." His handshake was firm, calculated. "You're looking well." "Appearances can be deceiving," I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Lunch proceeded like a chess match. We discussed politics, the market, Seattle's endless transformation, all while circling the true purpose of this meeting. I declined wine, needing clarity. He ordered a $100 Bordeaux without consulting the list. "The brewery expansion," he finally said, dabbing his lips with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Mara tells me it's quite significant." I nodded, spearing a perfect scallop. $800,000 in financing. "We're tripling production capacity." His eyes, Mara's eyes in an older, colder face, assessed me. "Ambitious. I never took you for the type." "People evolve, Victor." I set down my fork. "Sometimes in surprising ways." "Indeed." He swirled his wine thoughtfully. "Have you considered taking on a partner? Someone with financial expertise?" And there it was. The opening gambit. Actually, I've been considering bringing in outside oversight for our accounting, I said, watching his reaction carefully. Recent discrepancies have me concerned. The slightest tightening around his mouth, there and gone in an instant. Discrepancies? I shrugged. Probably nothing. But with the expansion funds coming in Friday, I can't be too careful. I've scheduled a forensic audit next week. The lie landed perfectly. Victor's knuckles whitened around his wine stem, the only tell from a man who'd built his fortune on an unreadable poker face. That seems excessive, he managed, voice even. Your brewery accountant. Was recommended by Julian Reese, if I recall. I smiled pleasantly. One of Mara's more useful introductions. Victor recovered quickly, smoothing his tie. Well, it's your business, Elias. Though these auditors can create mountains from molehills. Better safe than sorry. I checked my watch. My regular digital one, not my father's pocket watch. I should get back to work. Thanks for lunch, Victor. As I stood, he caught my wrist. My daughter loves you, Elias. The most blatant lie of our entire meal. I met his gaze steadily. I know exactly how much Mara loves me, I replied, each word measured. To the penny. I left him with the check and his thoughts, my mask finally slipping as I exited into the Seattle afternoon. The first seeds of doubt had been planted, now to water them and watch them grow. Back at the brewery, I found my assistant manager frowning over inventory sheets. Problem? I asked, hanging up my jacket. Your wife called, he said. Asked about the expansion account details. Said you forgot to bring the paperwork home. I nodded as if this were perfectly normal. Thanks. Another line cast. Another hook baited. When I reached for my phone to text Mara, I realized with a start that my father's watch was missing from my pocket. The absence of my father's watch gnawed at me throughout the afternoon. Its disappearance was too convenient, too strategic to be accidental. Had Mara noticed me checking it repeatedly, sensed its newfound importance? Or had Victor spotted it during our lunch, recognized the symbolism of me carrying the abandoned heirloom? By 6, the brewery was quiet except for the steady hum of fermentation tanks. I dismissed the staff early, needing solitude to execute the next phase of my plan. The expansion documents lay spread across my desk, legitimate paperwork interleaved with falsified projections I'd discovered hidden in Mara's home office during a deliberate search last night. My phone vibrated with an incoming call from a number I hadn't seen in 5 years. Michael Chin, former cybersecurity specialist and my college roommate before life took us in different directions. That was fast, I said by way of greeting. Your message sounded urgent. Michael's voice carried the same quiet intensity one remembered. Broke into any good financial systems lately? Just my own, apparently. I leaned back in my chair, eyes tracing the brewery's exposed beams. Thank you for calling. You mentioned an audit. Unofficial capacity. Yes. I chose my words carefully. I need to understand how someone might divert funds from an incoming wire transfer without triggering alerts. A long pause followed. This isn't theoretical, is it? No. Another silence, then, 8 o'clock. Analog coffee on Capitol Hill. Bring cash and leave your phone at home. The line went dead. I arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes early, positioning myself at a corner table with clear sight lines to both entrances. Seattle's evening drizzle had driven most patrons inside, creating a humid atmosphere of coffee steam and damp wool. Michael appeared precisely at 8, still rail-thin but with new lines etched around his eyes. 5 years at one of Seattle's tech giants had clearly taken its toll. You look like shit, he offered his greeting, sliding into the seat opposite me. Good to see you too. He studied me for a long moment. Who's trying to take you down, Eli? I slid an envelope across the table. $2,000. For your expertise only, not your involvement. He didn't touch the money. Answer the question. My wife. The words felt strange leaving my mouth, the first time I'd spoken the truth aloud. Her lover. Possibly her father. They're planning to intercept expansion funds coming into my brewery account on Friday. Michael's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. We'd both grown up with family betrayals, though his had been more dramatic. Parents who'd fled China, leaving him with relatives who resented the burden. Show me what you have. I produced copies of the manipulated accounting documents and the burner phone messages I'd photographed, then explained my findings about Julian's background. Michael reviewed everything methodically, occasionally making notes in a small book with a fountain pen. No digital footprints. Your wife's lover isn't just a pretty face, he finally said. This is a variation on a classic business email compromise scam, but with an insider, your wife, providing authentication details. They've created shadow accounts that mirror your legitimate ones. Can they be stopped? Not without evidence that would stand up in court. He hesitated. Which means you'd need to let them succeed to a point, then catch them in the act. I nodded, having already reached the same conclusion. And the missing watch? A distraction, Michael said immediately. They're testing your awareness, seeing if you notice things disappearing. Classic gaslighting technique. He slid the envelope back toward me. Keep your money. But take this instead. He handed me a simple thumb drive. It's a keylogger. Install it on your home computer and it will record everything typed, including passwords. If they're using your home network for any of this, you'll have evidence. Thank you. I pocketed the drive. I wasn't sure you'd help. His smile was thin. Some debts don't expire with time, Eli. You stood by me when my world collapsed. I haven't forgotten. As we parted outside, the rain having temporarily subsided, Michael gripped my shoulder. Be careful. People who can betray those closest to them are capable of far worse when cornered. I returned to the brewery rather than home, unwilling to face Mara's performance of concern over my late hours. The missing watch would give her the perfect opening to probe for weaknesses in my facade. Instead, I continued my research into Julian Reese's real estate dealings. Public records revealed a pattern: properties changing hands at inflated prices through shell companies, all linked to the same offshore entity in the Cayman Islands. Money laundering, expertly disguised as legitimate transactions. And on 3 separate occasions, the notary who'd verified these suspicious deals was none other than Diane Harrington, Mara's mother and Victor's wife. The conspiracy ran deeper than I'd imagined, tentacles extending through family connections I'd foolishly trusted. A family that had never truly accepted me now schemed to destroy me from within. As midnight approached, I found myself staring at the wedding photo on my desk. Mara and I laughing in the Seattle sunshine on the rooftop of the Space Needle, Mount Rainier perfect in the background. A rare clear day in a city known for clouds. A perfect metaphor for our marriage. I traced her face in the photo, wondering when exactly she'd decided I was expendable. When love had transformed into resentment, then calculation. The woman I'd married was still visible beneath the mask of the stranger she'd become, making the betrayal all the more painful. I opened my desk drawer to put the photo away and froze. There, nestled among paperclips and pens, lay my father's pocket watch. Exactly where I never would have left it. Someone had been in my office. Someone wanted me to know they had access to everything. The game was escalating, the players revealing themselves one by one. And Friday was only 2 days away. Thursday morning dawned gray and restless, Seattle's skyline barely visible through the fog that clung to the city like a shroud. One day until the transfer. One day to set my trap. I left the brewery at dawn after a sleepless night, the pocket watch secure in my jacket, a silent reminder of betrayal and resilience. The reappearance of the timepiece in my office drawer was meant to unsettle me, to make me question my sanity. Instead, it had hardened my resolve. At 7:30, I arrived at my bank, Washington Trust, where I'd built a relationship with the manager over years of brewery business. Sandra Kim greeted me with professional warmth, ushering me into her glass-walled office overlooking Pioneer Square. "This is unusual, Eli," she said once we were seated. "Most business owners are thrilled about expansion funding, not concerned." I leaned forward, keeping my voice low despite our privacy. "I need to verify the security protocols for tomorrow's transfer." $800,000 is significant, she acknowledged. But our systems are extremely secure. The funds will arrive from Northwest Credit exactly as planned. That's what worries me. I placed a folder on her desk. I've discovered discrepancies in our internal accounting. Nothing concrete yet, but enough to raise red flags. Sandra's expression shifted from reassurance to concern as she reviewed the documents, carefully selected pages that hinted at irregularities without revealing my full knowledge. "This could be simple error," she offered, but her tone lacked conviction. "Perhaps," I conceded. "But I'd like to implement additional verification steps for any outgoing transfers above $10,000 for the next 30 days. And I need it done quietly." Understanding dawned in her eyes. As a bank manager, she'd seen enough fraud cases to recognize the signs. "You suspect internal theft." I neither confirmed nor denied, letting my silence speak volumes. By 8:45, the safeguards were in place, a secondary authentication requirement known only to Sandra and myself. Any significant movement of funds would trigger an immediate alert to my private email. My next stop was calculated to be seen. I visited Carver Craft's main distribution partner, Northwest Beverage, and engaged in a loud, public argument about delivery schedules. A performance intended for the sales rep I knew had connections to Julian through the local business network. "This expansion is killing me," I declared, loud enough for the entire office to hear. "The bank's questioning our numbers, suppliers are balking at the increased orders. It's a mess." The seeds of doubt were planted. Within hours, word would spread of Carver Craft's apparent financial troubles. The third phase of my plan was the most delicate. I returned to the brewery and called an emergency staff meeting, excluding only our accountant, Julian's plant within my operation. "I need your discretion," I told my 12 loyal employees. "Tomorrow we're receiving a major funds transfer for our expansion. There may be irregularities in our accounting that I'm investigating quietly." My production manager, Teresa, frowned. "Are we in trouble, Eli?" "No," I assured them. "But I need everyone to operate normally while being vigilant. Report anything unusual directly to me, not to accounting." I avoided specifics, giving them just enough information to be alert without sparking panic. These people had helped me build Carver Craft from nothing. Their livelihoods were at stake too. By mid-afternoon, my phone was buzzing with concerned texts from suppliers who'd heard rumors of our financial issues. Perfect. News travels fast in Seattle's tight-knit craft brewing community. At 4:17, the call I'd been anticipating finally came. Julian Reese, his number no longer disguised. "Eli," he began, voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Heard there might be some hiccups with the expansion. Anything I can help with?" I injected just the right amount of stress into my reply. "Just suppliers getting nervous. Nothing I can't handle. You know," he continued, "I have investors looking for opportunities in the craft sector. If you need emergency capital." The vulture circling. "I appreciate that, Julian. Actually, I was going to call you. Mara mentioned you might have contacts at other banks if this financing falls apart." His interest was palpable through the connection. "Absolutely. Why don't we grab a drink tonight? The whiskey bar at 7? "Perfect," I agreed, ending the call with a grim smile. The final piece clicked into place at 5:46 when Mara called, her voice a masterpiece of wifely concern. "I heard about the problems with the expansion," she began, no explanation of how such news had reached her. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Didn't want to worry you," I replied, the lie coming easily now. "Besides, it might still work out." "Julian called," she said too casually. "He mentioned meeting you for drinks. I think I'll join you both. 3 heads are better than 1, right?" I agreed readily, the perfect mark walking into their adjusted scheme. They needed to believe I was financially desperate, ready to accept their help when the transfer failed. As twilight settled over Seattle, I retrieved my father's watch from my jacket pocket and wound it carefully. The soft clicking of its mechanism reminded me of moments ticking away toward inevitable confrontation. Tomorrow's transfer would proceed as planned. But tonight I would give the performance of my life. A man watching his dream crumble, unaware of the real threat lurking beside him. I placed the watch in my breast pocket, close to my heart. Some timepieces count down to destruction. Others mark the moments before justice. Seattle's famous fog had descended by 7, transforming the downtown streets into a film noir set. Street lamps haloed in mist, pedestrians reduced to silhouettes. The whiskey bar occupied the ground floor of a renovated warehouse, its windows glowing amber against the encroaching night. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a corner booth with a view of both entrances and the bar. The bartender, recognizing me from previous visits, brought my usual Carver Craft IPA, the flagship beer from my own brewery. A small act of defiance against the whiskey Julian would undoubtedly order. At 7 sharp, Julian appeared, predator sleek in a tailored charcoal suit, moving through the crowd with practiced ease. He spotted me immediately, raising his hand in greeting as if we were old friends rather than conspirators in a drama of his design. "Eli," he clasped my hand firmly, sliding into the booth. "Rough day from the sound of it." "Could be worse," I offered, taking a deliberate sip of my beer. Julian signaled the server, ordering a 20-year Macallan without consulting the menu, a casual display of status. Suppliers getting cold feet is standard with expansions. I've seen it countless times. Have you? I raised an eyebrow. In your real estate work? A flicker of something, caution perhaps, crossed his face before his smile reasserted itself. Business is business. The players change, but the game remains the same. Before I could press further, Mara appeared through the fog-shrouded entrance. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, professional enough to suggest a business meeting, but with subtle touches of allure meant for Julian's eyes. The diamond earrings I'd given her for our anniversary caught the light as she approached. "Sorry I'm late," she said, kissing my cheek, a gesture as empty as our vows had become. She slid in beside Julian, their bodies angled toward each other with unconscious intimacy. "Julian was just explaining how common financing hiccups are," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "Absolutely," Julian interjected smoothly. "And I've been telling Eli that I have investors who might be interested in Carver Craft. A capital injection could solve these short-term issues." Mara's eyes brightened with practiced enthusiasm. "That sounds promising. What kind of terms would they expect?" The conversation flowed like the alcohol, Julian outlining increasingly predatory investment scenarios, Mara offering supportive comments, both gauging my reactions. I played my part, the desperate business owner seeing his dream falter, gradually warming to their solution. "These investors," I asked after Julian's second scotch had loosened his guard, "are they connected to Victor's firm?" A pause, fractionally too long. Julian and Mara exchanged a glance loaded with unspoken communication. "Not directly," Julian hedged. "Though Victor might have mentioned your situation to them." "Interesting," I mused. "I had lunch with your father yesterday," I added, turning to Mara. "He seemed concerned about the brewery's finances too. Almost as if he knew about these problems before they happened." Mara's laugh was a brittle thing. "Dad's always worried about money. You know how he is." I did know. Better than they realized. "Well," I said, draining my beer, "I should probably meet these investors before tomorrow's transfer. If the bank pulls out, I'll need options." Julian leaned forward, the predator scenting weakness. "Actually, I'm meeting Victor tonight. Why don't you join us? He's been wanting to discuss a family matter anyway." The trap within their trap. I hesitated just long enough to seem reluctant before agreeing. 20 minutes later, we arrived at the Columbia Tower Club on the 76th floor, Seattle's fog now beneath us like a roiling sea. Victor awaited in a private room, single malt in hand, surprise poorly concealed as I entered behind Julian and Mara. "Elias," he recovered quickly, extending his hand. "This is unexpected. Julian thought I should hear about these investors directly," I explained, taking the seat opposite him. "Given tomorrow's deadline." Victor shot Julian a look that promised future consequences. "Of course. Though I'd hoped to discuss another matter first. Something of a personal nature." Mara and Julian exchanged glances before excusing themselves to the bar, leaving me alone with Victor. As the door closed behind them, his demeanor shifted from cordial to coldly precise. "You've been making inquiries," he stated without preamble. "About Julian's business dealings. About my firm." I didn't bother denying it. Know your partners before doing business. Basic diligence. "This isn't about business." Victor leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This is about family. My daughter made a mistake. Her association with Julian has created certain vulnerabilities." "Vulnerabilities?" I repeated, the word hanging between us. "Financial entanglements," Victor clarified. "Julian has leveraged Mara's position in your company. Her access to your accounts." Understanding dawned. "You're not supporting their scheme. Julian's blackmailing you." Victor's face remained impassive, but something in his eyes confirmed my hypothesis. "The brewery expansion provides an opportunity to resolve these entanglements permanently. A small diversion of funds. A one-time solution to protect the family name." "My family too," I reminded him quietly. "You were never family," he replied without emotion. "Simply a phase Mara needed to outgrow." Before I could respond, the door opened. Julian returned alone, his expression shifting instantly as he assessed the tension in the room. "Where's Mara?" I asked, hand instinctively moving to my pocket where the watch rested. "Taking a call," Julian answered smoothly, too smoothly. "Now, about those investors." But I was already standing, a cold certainty forming in my gut. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I spotted a familiar figure on the observation deck. Mara, backlit against Seattle's skyline, watching me through the glass. And in that moment I realized I was being watched from both sides, caught between shadows and the fog. Morning broke over Seattle like a fever, the fog burned away by unexpected March sunshine that felt like nature's mockery of the darkness I'd witnessed last night. Friday had arrived. Transfer day. After leaving the Columbia Tower Club, I'd driven aimlessly through the city's hills, piecing together the revised puzzle. Julian wasn't merely Mara's lover but her manipulator, using her gambling debts as leverage to target both the brewery and Victor's tarnished empire. My wife, once the central villain in my narrative, had been recast as both betrayer and victim, a complexity I hadn't anticipated. By dawn, I'd formulated my adjusted plan. The brewery's tasting room would host a private event tonight, ostensibly a pre-celebration of our expansion, invitations extended to suppliers, distributors, and key figures in Seattle's craft beer scene, including, pointedly, Julian, Mara, and the Harringtons. "Are you sure about this?" Teresa asked as we arranged tables in the cavernous industrial space. Morning light streamed through the high windows, catching the gleaming fermentation tanks that would soon double in number, assuming the day's events proceeded as planned. "The transfer's secure," I assured her, though we both knew that wasn't her real question. "And everyone needs reassurance after yesterday's rumors." She nodded, unconvinced but loyal. Teresa had been with me since the brewery's beginning, sleeping on the concrete floor during our first production run, celebrating our first regional distribution deal with cheap champagne and expensive hopes. If anyone deserved the truth, it was her. "Just be careful," she said finally. "Whatever's happening beyond the expansion, be careful." By 11, I was at Washington Trust, finalizing the transfer details with Sandra. Her office offered a perfect view of Pioneer Square, tourists already gathering despite the early hour. "The additional verification protocol is in place," she confirmed, sliding paperwork across her desk. "Any outgoing transfer will require dual authentication. And as requested, we've flagged the specific accounts you identified." I signed where indicated, each stroke of the pen another tick of the clock counting down to confrontation. "And the timing?" "Northwest Credit initiated the transfer at 9 this morning. It should clear by 2 this afternoon." She hesitated. "Eli, if you're right about this." "Let's hope I'm not," I interrupted with a smile that felt stretched thin across my face. From the bank, I drove to a small tech repair shop in Fremont where Michael waited, his narrow frame hunched over a laptop. "Right on time," he observed without looking up. "You look terrible, by the way." "Rough night. Productive, though." He turned the screen toward me, displaying a series of emails recovered from the keylogger. "Your wife's been busy. Lots of communication with an offshore account manager. Very careful about details except for this." He pointed to a sequence of numbers buried in an apparently innocent message about party planning. "Account routing information," he explained, "disguised as a date and address. And this," he pulled up another screen, "is the shadow account I found through the credentials she used on your home network. They're planning to intercept the transfer mid-process, using authentication details from your brewery's accounting system." I studied the evidence, the final pieces locking into place. "Can you trace where the money would end up?" Michael shook his head. "Multiple shells. But I've documented the entire structure. Enough for the authorities if that's your play." It wasn't, not yet. Justice without understanding would be hollow victory. "One more thing," I said, handing him a small device. "Can you make this work with the brewery's sound system?" "Wirelessly." He examined the modified recorder, eyebrows rising. "Planning a special soundtrack for your party?" "Something like that." By the time I returned to the brewery, the transfer had completed, $800,000 safely deposited into Carver Craft's business account. I checked the security protocols once more before beginning preparations for the evening event. At 4, Mara called. "I invited Mom and Dad to your thing tonight," she said without preamble. "They're looking forward to celebrating with us." "Perfect," I replied, imagining Victor's reluctance. "The more family the better. And Julian's coming too. For support." I wouldn't have it any other way. As evening approached, I stood in my office watching staff transform the tasting room below. Soft lighting illuminated copper fixtures. Kegs were positioned for the special expansion batch we'd brewed, tables arranged for optimal mingling. The stage was set. I removed my father's pocket watch from my desk drawer where I'd secured it that morning. Its brass case caught the fading light as I wound it carefully, each turn of the key another moment closer to revelation. My phone pinged with an alert from the bank, a declined transfer attempt on the expansion funds, exactly as predicted. They were making their move early, trying to divert the money before the evening event. Another ping followed seconds later, a second attempt blocked. I smiled grimly. Let them grow desperate. Let them wonder what had gone wrong with their perfect plan. As I slipped the watch into my vest pocket, I noticed movement on the brewery floor. Julian had arrived early, ostensibly to help set up, more likely to assess why their financial maneuver had failed. He glanced up, catching my eye through the office window. For a moment we simply regarded each other, predator and prey, though he no longer knew which was which. The watch ticked steadily against my chest as I descended to greet him, counting down the moments until everything would unravel. Eli. Julian's smile was camera-ready as we shook hands, his grip firm and lingering. Quite the turnout you're expecting. Nothing brings people together like success, I replied, guiding him through the brewery. Servers arranged platters while bartenders prepped taps for the evening's showcase of Carver Craft specialties. Or the illusion of it. His eyes narrowed slightly. Meaning? I gestured vaguely. Perception is everything in business. You of all people understand that. He laughed, but the sound held no warmth. Speaking of perceptions, I tried calling those investors earlier. Strangely, they couldn't be reached. Mercury must be in retrograde, I offered, deadpan. Bad day for communications all around. Before he could respond, the brewery doors swung open and Mara entered, stunning in a deep blue dress that matched the Carver Craft logo colors. A deliberate choice, I was certain. Her eyes darted between Julian and me, gauging the atmosphere. Everything looks amazing, she said, kissing my cheek with practiced affection. You'd never know there were problems yesterday. Amazing how quickly things resolve themselves, I agreed, watching her face for reaction. The transfer came through without a hitch. The briefest flicker of confusion crossed her features. That's wonderful news, isn't it? I turned to include Julian in my smile. $800,000 safely in our account. Julian maintained his composure, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. Congratulations. I should get a drink to celebrate. As he moved toward the bar, Mara clutched my arm. Eli, we should talk about the expansion plans. I've had some thoughts about the marketing approach. Later, I promised, extracting myself gently. We have guests arriving. Over the next hour, the brewery filled with Seattle's craft beer community, competitors who became friends, suppliers, distributors, local restaurant owners who'd been early supporters. I moved among them easily, the gracious host, all while monitoring the increasingly tense exchanges between Julian, Mara, and Victor, who had arrived with his wife Diane in tow. At 8:30, I approached the small stage we'd set up between fermentation tanks. Conversation hushed as I tapped the microphone. Thank you all for coming tonight, I began, surveying the crowd. Carver Craft has always been about authenticity, honest ingredients, transparent processes, genuine relationships. My eyes found Mara's in the crowd. She raised her glass slightly, misreading my gaze as acknowledgement. Which is why tonight is special, I continued. Not just because we're celebrating our expansion, but because we're welcoming a new partner to the Carver Craft family. Confusion rippled through the room. This wasn't part of the announced plan. I'd like to introduce Lydia Ramirez. I gestured toward the door where a woman in a crisp suit entered. Until recently, CFO at Westlake Investment Group. Victor's face went ashen. Westlake was his firm's main competitor, and Lydia had been pursuing evidence of their ethical violations for years. Lydia will be overseeing our financial operations moving forward, I announced, ensuring complete transparency in all our accounting. From the corner of my eye, I saw Julian moving toward an exit. But Teresa was already there, blocking his path with a tray of drinks and a knowing smile. And while we're making announcements, I continued, I'd like to recognize the Washington State Banking Commission representatives who joined us tonight. Two men near the back straightened, clearly surprised at being identified. They weren't from the Banking Commission, just friends of Michael's playing a part, but Julian and Mara didn't know that. They've been instrumental in identifying some irregularities in recent banking activities related to Carver Craft. The room had gone completely silent, all eyes on me. Finally, I want to thank the person who made all this possible. I reached into my pocket, removing the recorder Michael had modified. My wife, Mara. I pressed play and Mara's voice filled the brewery. He's clueless. I'll drain him dry. Julian's response followed. The expansion loan approval is our window. Once we divert the funds offshore, even his fancy lawyer friends won't trace it. Color drained from Mara's face as her own words condemned her. Victor stepped forward, fury etched in every line of his aristocratic face. Enough, he bellowed. This is a private matter, not a public spectacle. Is it private? I challenged, raising my voice to match his. When you agreed to help Julian cover Mara's gambling debts by stealing from my business. When you notarized fraudulent property documents through your wife to launder the money. Diane Harrington gasped, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her throat. Victor, what is he talking about? The room erupted in whispers. Julian, seeing his scheme imploding, made a desperate move toward the door again. This time, one of Michael's friends stepped in his path. "The authorities have complete documentation," I announced, though I hadn't yet involved them. "Every transfer attempt, every forged signature, every shell company." Mara pushed through the crowd toward me, tears streaking her immaculate makeup. "Eli, please, you don't understand. Julian has things on my father. I had no choice." "There's always a choice, Mara," I said quietly, but the microphone carried my words throughout the room. "You just made the wrong one." Repeatedly. As I looked out at the stunned faces of my guests, I felt no triumph, only a hollow vindication. The pocket watch weighed heavy against my chest, ticking away the final moments of my marriage, of illusions, of the life I'd built. Suddenly, Victor lunged forward, reaching inside his jacket. Several people screamed, thinking he was drawing a weapon. But what emerged from his pocket was far more dangerous than any gun, a truth I wasn't prepared for. What Victor pulled from his jacket was a yellowed envelope, its edges frayed with age. He thrust it toward me, hand trembling with barely contained rage. "You want truth, Elias? Here's your precious truth." The brewery remained silent, the audience captivated by our unscripted drama. I took the envelope cautiously, noticing my name written in faded ink across the front, handwriting I recognized with a jolt. My father's. "Open it," Victor commanded. "Let everyone see the man behind your righteous indignation." My fingers felt numb as I extracted the letter, the paper thin and delicate. The date at the top, 28 years ago. 2 years after my father had abandoned my mother and me. "Read it," Victor insisted, his voice cold. Out loud. I cleared my throat, the world narrowing to the words before me. "Victor, I'm writing as agreed to confirm receipt of your payment. I understand the terms. I'll remain gone with no contact with my son. The additional funds for my silence regarding Harrington Investments activities are appreciated. Our arrangement is concluded. James Carver." The microphone captured my every word, broadcasting my father's betrayal to the stunned crowd. The letter shook in my hand as understanding dawned. Victor hadn't merely disliked me. He'd purchased my fatherless childhood. "Your noble father," Victor announced, "sold his parental rights for $50,000 and information about certain investment opportunities. A bargain, considering the circumstances." I found my voice, though it sounded distant to my own ears. "What circumstances?" "Your mother was having an affair with my business partner," Victor said, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. "Your father discovered it and threatened a scandal that would have destroyed Harrington Investments in its infancy. I merely negotiated a mutually beneficial solution." Mara stepped forward, shock evident on her face. "Dad, you never told me." "Be quiet," Victor snapped. "You've done enough damage." He turned back to me. "Your mother chose my partner over your father. James chose money over you. And you, Elias, you chose revenge over understanding what Mara was trying to protect." "What was she protecting, Victor?" I demanded, anger burning through my shock. "Your reputation? Your crimes?" "My family," Mara interrupted, finding her courage. "Julian discovered what Dad did, to your father, to others. He had proof of decades of financial manipulation. He threatened to expose everything unless—" She faltered. "Unless you helped him steal from me," I finished. Julian, seeing his leverage evaporating, made another move toward the exit. This time, Teresa stepped directly into his path. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her normally gentle voice hard as steel. He reached out to push her aside. I moved without thinking, crossing the room in seconds to grab his arm. "Touch her, and our agreement is void," I warned quietly. Julian's eyes narrowed. "What agreement?" "The one where I don't press charges immediately," I replied. "The one where you get 24 hours to return every dollar you've taken from Mara, from Victor, from anyone else you've blackmailed, before I turn everything over to the authorities." "You have nothing," he bluffed, but uncertainty flickered across his face. I smiled without humor. "Michael," I called out. My friend approached, laptop in hand, and turned the screen toward Julian. On it were detailed records of every transaction, every shell company, every fraudulent property deal he'd orchestrated. Julian's confidence crumbled visibly. "I was just the messenger," he stammered. "Victor's the one who—" "Save it for your lawyer," Michael advised. As Julian slumped in defeat, I turned back to Victor and Mara, aware that our audience had begun to disperse, giving us the illusion of privacy in the crowded room. "So this was your game," I said to Victor. "Pay off my father, manipulate my mother, then watch me marry your daughter without ever knowing how thoroughly you'd orchestrated my life's tragedy." Don't flatter yourself, Victor retorted. Mara's marriage to you was her own mistake, not my design. I merely saw an opportunity in Julian's scheme to finally be rid of you. Dad, stop, Mara pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Enough. I looked at my wife, this stranger I'd shared a bed with for 12 years, and felt only emptiness where rage should be. Why didn't you come to me? When Julian first approached you? Because I was ashamed, she whispered. The gambling? It started after I lost our baby 3 years ago. You never knew. I couldn't bear to see the disappointment in your eyes. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. What? 8 weeks along, she continued, voice breaking. I miscarried while you were at a brewing conference. I told you my business trip was extended because I couldn't face you. Couldn't admit I'd failed at the one thing your mother never got to give you, a family. The brewery seemed to tilt on its axis. A child. A loss I'd never known about, grieved for, or helped her through. Victor moved to put his arm around Mara, but she shrugged him off, stepping toward me instead. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Eli. Just understanding that this wasn't about you. Julian found me at my lowest and exploited it. I was weak. I was wrong. But I never stopped. She couldn't finish. The pocket watch ticked against my chest, marking the seconds of shared silence. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing closer. 3 weeks passed like a fever dream. The brewery stood silent, fermentation tanks empty for the first time since opening day. Yellow police tape still clung to the office door, though the forensic accountants had finished their work days ago. Their conclusion: Julian had orchestrated financial fraud spanning multiple businesses, with the brewery expansion merely his latest target. I sat alone at the bar, surrounded by shadows of what had been. The expansion loan remained untouched in the secured account, its purpose uncertain now. The morning newspaper lay before me, business section open to a small headline: Seattle real estate agent charged in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Julian's corporate headshot stared back at me, his practiced smile now reading as the smirk of a confidence man. The brewery door creaked open, admitting a slice of spring sunshine and Teresa's familiar silhouette. Thought I'd find you here, she said, sliding onto the stool beside mine. Hiding from the world? Contemplating, I corrected, pushing the paper aside. The distributors called again. They want to know when we're resuming production. And? I shrugged, spinning my father's pocket watch on the bar's surface. I'd taken to carrying it constantly now, a reminder of time's relentless forward motion despite personal catastrophes. I'm not sure there's anything left to produce. Teresa's expression tightened with concern. The brewery is more than what happened here, Eli. It's years of work, people's livelihoods, your dream. Dreams change, I said softly. We sat in companionable silence as afternoon light crawled across the concrete floor. I'd sent the staff home with full pay for a month while I restructured, a euphemism for the paralysis of decision that had gripped me since that night. Victor had avoided criminal charges by providing evidence against Julian and making restitution to previous victims of his financial manipulations. His firm was finished, his reputation in tatters, but his freedom remained intact, a final privilege of wealth and connection. Diane had filed for divorce the day after the revelations, already remaking herself as the deceived wife rather than the knowing accomplice. Seattle society would eventually welcome her back. They always did. And Mara? Mara had moved out the morning after, leaving her keys and wedding ring on the kitchen counter without a note. She checked into rehab for her gambling addiction 2 days later. My lawyer had delivered divorce papers to her facility last week, unsigned and without demands. Whatever settlement she wanted, I would agree to. Some prices were worth paying for freedom. You've had an offer for the brewery, Teresa said finally, breaking the silence. Lars from Fremont Brewing. He called this morning. I nodded, unsurprised. News traveled fast in Seattle's brewing community. What did you tell him? To talk to you directly. She hesitated. It's a good offer, Eli. Above market value. The staff could transfer over, keep their jobs. You could start over? I finished for her. Is that such a terrible thought? I considered the question honestly. The brewery had been my life's work, born from the ashes of a corporate career I'd abandoned to pursue something authentic. Every recipe, every label design, every relationship with hop farmers and grain suppliers, all bore the imprint of my passion and vision. I don't know who I am without this place, I admitted. Teresa's hand covered mine briefly. Maybe it's time to find out. She left shortly after, extracting a promise that I'd call Lars tomorrow. The brewery fell silent again, though the emptiness felt less oppressive somehow. At 6, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but some instinct prompted me to answer. Is this Elias Carver? A woman's voice, professional and distant. Speaking. This is Northwest Medical Center. We're calling because you're listed as emergency contact for Mara Harrington. My breath caught. She'd already reverted to her maiden name. Is she all right? She's stable, the voice assured me. But she's requesting to see you. Only if you're willing. 20 minutes later, I walked through antiseptic hallways to a private room where Mara sat on the edge of a hospital bed, looking smaller somehow. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her gaze was clearer than I'd seen in years. Thank you for coming, she said, voice raspy. I wasn't sure you would. What happened? I asked, maintaining my distance. Anxiety attack, she admitted. The therapist says it's part of the process. Facing consequences, feeling the emotions I've been gambling to avoid. I nodded, uncertain what she wanted from me. I signed the papers, she said after a moment. My lawyer will deliver them tomorrow. I'm not contesting anything. That's not why I came. I know. She looked down at her hands, bare of jewelry now. I wanted to give you something. From the bedside table, she retrieved a small box and held it out. Inside lay a key I recognized, to a storage facility in Ballard. Unit 17, she explained. Everything your mother left behind when she died. I found the key in your father's watch case years ago but never told you. I think I wanted to hurt you even then. To keep something from you that mattered. I took the key, its weight insignificant compared to the implications of her words. My mother's belongings, papers, photos, memories I'd thought lost forever when her apartment had been cleared after her death. Why now? I asked. Because truth matters, she replied simply. Even when it hurts. Maybe especially then. I pocketed the key beside the watch, these twin artifacts of a past I was only beginning to understand. Goodbye, Mara, I said finally, the words bearing the weight of 12 years of promises made and broken, of a life built on foundations more fragile than I'd ever realized. Goodbye, Eli. As I walked out of the hospital into the gathering dusk, Seattle's skyline glittered with the lights of lives continuing, changing, ending, beginning. The city I'd called home now felt like a place I was seeing through new eyes, as a traveler passing through rather than a permanent resident. I pulled out my phone and called Lars. The storage unit in Ballard smelled of dust and forgotten things. Early morning light filtered through a small window, illuminating dancing particles in the air as I rolled up the metal door. Unit 17, untouched for nearly a decade. Inside, cardboard boxes were stacked with my mother's precise handwriting labeling each one. Kitchen, books, photos. The artifacts of a life cut short, preserved in this concrete tomb while I'd moved forward, unaware of their existence. I started with a box labeled simply James. My father's name in my mother's handwriting felt like a collision of worlds that should have remained separate. Inside, I found letters spanning years, correspondence that continued long after he'd supposedly abandoned us completely. The truth unfolded in faded ink and yellowed paper. My father hadn't simply vanished for money. Victor's payment had been coercion, protection for my mother from financial ruin after she'd become unknowingly entangled in one of Victor's early investment schemes. My father had left to keep her safe, corresponding in secret while maintaining the fiction of complete abandonment. In the final letter, dated just before my mother's cancer diagnosis, he'd written, "I'll come back when it's safe, when Victor's hold is broken. Until then, the pocket watch is my promise to you both. A reminder that time may separate us, but it also heals." He never knew she was dying. She never told him. Beneath the letters lay a sealed envelope addressed to me in my mother's handwriting, dated 3 days before her death. My hands trembled as I opened it. "My dearest Eli," she began. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Forgive me for the secrets I've kept. Your father didn't abandon us. He protected us at terrible cost to himself. The truth about Victor Harrington and what he did to our family is all here. Use it wisely, not for revenge but for justice. And remember that your father loves you wherever he is now. The watch was his promise to return. Perhaps it can lead you to him still." I sat on the concrete floor, surrounded by the remnants of my mother's life and the truth she'd protected me from. The pocket watch ticked steadily in my hand, no longer an emblem of abandonment but a beacon of sacrifice and enduring connection. Among the photos I found one I'd never seen. My father holding me as an infant, my mother beside him, all three of us laughing in the sunshine. On the back, an address in Tucson, Arizona, written in my mother's hand with a question mark beside it. 6 weeks later, I stood on a sun-baked street in Tucson, squinting at modest houses with desert-adapted gardens. The brewery sale had closed smoothly, Lars proving to be a generous and fair buyer. Teresa and the entire staff had kept their jobs with improved benefits, my one non-negotiable condition. I'd used some of the proceeds to establish a craft brewing scholarship in my mother's name. The rest waited in an account for whatever came next in my undetermined future. The house at the address my mother had noted was painted a soft adobe color, with cacti and desert wildflowers lining the walkway. A man in his 60s worked in the garden, his back to me as he tended to a struggling plant. Even from behind, I recognized something in the set of his shoulders, the careful precision of his movements. My father's watch felt heavy in my palm as I approached. He turned at the sound of my footsteps, surprise registering on a face that mirrored my own in ways I'd never seen in photographs. "Elias?" he whispered, disbelief etched across features weathered by sun and time. "Hello, Dad." His garden shears clattered to the ground. "How did you?" "Mom left me a map," I said simply, holding out the watch. "And this?" His hand shook as he reached for the timepiece, his fingers brushing mine in the first contact we'd had in 30 years. "I never thought." He couldn't continue, emotion closing his throat. "I know about Victor," I said. "About the deal. About all of it." My eyes, filled with tears. "I wanted to come back. After your mother died, I tried to find you, but you disappeared into your new life. Then when I saw your name connected to that brewery in Seattle, I was afraid my presence would only bring Victor's attention back to you." "Victor's finished," I told him. "His empire's gone. Your sacrifice wasn't in vain, but it's over now." We stood in silence, 3 decades of absence suspended between us like the dust motes in that storage unit, illuminated but untouchable. "Would you like to come inside?" he finally asked, gesturing toward the house. "I can't give back the years we lost, but time heals," I finished, remembering my mother's words. "Or at least it gives us the chance to try." As we walked toward his home, perhaps, eventually, our home, the watch ticked steadily in his hand. Not counting down to anything now, but marking the beginning of something neither of us had dared to imagine. The past couldn't be rewritten, but the future remained unwound, its pages blank and waiting.